Trey, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You just came in from Israel?
I did, yeah.
I think a lot of people are curious right now. We're more than a month out, 2 months out from the ceasefire, what the state of play is on the ground.
Right now, the Israelis and Hamas, the two parties to the agreement, are in between phase 1 and phase 2. And so Hamas still has to release the bodies of 2 additional hostages that are being held inside Gaza. And when they complete that, the entire region, including the Americans who are now on the ground in southern Israel, will start to look deeper into phase 2 about how to implement the Trump administration's peace plan. Broadly, this involves Hamas disarming, laying down their weapons, and trying to usher in a new technocratic government for the Gaza Strip.
But for practical purposes, I think a lot of people are wondering what phase 2, if phase 2 can ever be completed, because underlying all of it is literally Hamas stopping what it's been doing for 4 decades, which is engaged in armed conflict, in pursuit of a Palestinian state. What is the reality when it comes to actually disarming Hamas? And when you talk to your sources there, how realistic do they think it is?
The reality is that Hamas may not lay down their weapons, and Israel may go back to war against the terrorist group inside Gaza on the ground. And that could mean months of fighting in the future. The challenging part, but also not so challenging, is that you have to report as things develop. And so where we are today is between phase 1 and phase 2. If the peace deal progresses, and ultimately we expect actually some progress to be made. There are still meetings taking place even as recently as today in Cairo with negotiators that are trying to hammer out the details of what this might look like. But as it moves forward, if it does progress and there is some agreement on the ground, it would avoid Israel having to go back into Hamas-controlled territory of Gaza. The reality, when you ask what's the real situation, is that we don't know all of the details of this plan. There are contingencies being discussed about how to basically cut Gaza in different places so that they can have demilitarized areas of the enclave to usher in ultimately what will be a technocratic government, but initially what will be an international stabilization force to try to keep the peace, train Palestinians to be a local police force, and then try to build pockets of stability within Gaza.
So basically a non-Hamas Gaza and then a area of Gaza that still has Hamas in it.
At least in the short term.
What incentives have they created for Hamas to disarm here? And maybe I should begin by asking, what is Hamas after the war here? After a couple of years of war, what's left of it? Because, I remember J.D. Vance made news several weeks ago when he's like, well, it's 40 different groups now. What is it? And to what extent can the Arab countries, can others sort of figure out what sort of the next version of it looks like?
Right now, it's a guerrilla militia. They're launching attacks when they can and sometimes firing over the yellow line that divides Israeli-controlled Gaza and Hamas-controlled Gaza.
When the yellow line, we're talking about they call it the yellow line.
They call it the yellow line, but there are actually concrete blocks now that are spray-painted yellow that divide Gaza.
Okay. So there's a literal yellow line.
There's a yellow line, and it has been a source of controversy because Hamas has fired over the yellow line, but Israel has also killed anyone who approaches the yellow line, including children. And so this becomes sort of a centerpiece in what the coverage looks like amid a ceasefire. But in terms of what's left of Hamas, they're an organization that previously had 15,000 rockets. They still have a few rockets that are stored likely in areas that the Israelis never entered, but they no longer are a massive aerial threat to Israel in the way that they were on October 6th of 2023. And also, the weapons that they have no way to resupply. They have no way to get more ammunition. The majority of the manufacturing sites within Gaza have been destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. And so it's an organization that will, in some areas, continue to operate and try to conduct limited attacks. But they are far weaker than they've ever been since they existed, and certainly since they took control of Gaza in 2006.
So, if based on your vantage point on the ground right now, based on the folks that you're talking to, based on your reporting right now, what are you looking for in the coming weeks and months here? As you said, there could be a return to war, but they're still negotiating here. Where are things leaning right now as we head into the end of the year?
Personally, what I'm looking for is access to Gaza. The Israeli government and military is still not allowing independent access to the Gaza Strip as they have done in the past. I entered Gaza in 2014 during the war, Sukkot, that 51-day war. I entered Gaza in 2018, in 2019, in 2021. Right now, journalists are not able to report in Gaza without a military embed. And so it makes it very difficult to cover the story.
The Israelis during the war were arguing it's for the safety of the journalists. What are they arguing today as to like what are they telling you when you're like, let me in?
It's a great question. We don't know, actually. And
like they don't make an argument.
They don't make an argument. There are currently actually conversations taking place within the Israeli Supreme Court because the government was sued by the Foreign Press Association to pressure the government to allow journalists to enter Gaza. And they have delayed this case over and over again. And it's currently in the middle of yet another delay. And so we actually don't have all the information as to why it's not being allowed right now. I did enter Gaza recently, about 3 weeks ago, on a military embed, along with a number of other Western media organizations. And you get just a sliver of what's actually
describe what that's like when you go in with the Israeli military. How much freedom do you really have?
You go to the location that they want you to go to, and you see what they want you to see. And in this particular embed, and I've been on many, we saw the Sajaiya neighborhood in northern Gaza that sits very close to the border with Israel, and it's completely leveled. This is where Hamas, actually even before October 7th, this is a little in the weeds of the details, this was known as a almost off-limits part of Gaza. Even when we would go there reporting inside Gaza before October 7th, it was considered a dangerous neighborhood. It has been completely leveled, and actually the position that we went to with the Israeli army, you could see lots of Gaza, but you couldn't interact with Palestinian civilians. You couldn't interview people. We couldn't report. And at the end of the day, I have been and will continue to be an advocate for press access. And I think it's critically important that the Israelis open the border to international journalists so that they can go in and report on the realities of the situation.
One of the arguments that was, made or speculated is that like, oh, well, Israel doesn't want to show the extent of the damage, right? But clearly we've seen the extent of the damage. You've been taken to neighborhoods. So what is the speculation? What are the assertions? What are the beliefs among reporters as to why Israel continues to restrict access here?
I don't want to speculate because I don't know. But the reality is, in the past, we have been given this access. And whether it's on the ground in Gaza or anywhere in the world, we have to be there to do our jobs, to be able to interview people, to do what journalists do, to act as the fourth estate, to hold militaries and governments accountable on all sides of all borders, and to report freely on the realities, at least from our perspective, often of civilians on the ground, because I think that they often tell the story of a conflict much better than governments, militaries, or terrorist organizations.
So short of being able to do that yourself, do you have fixers or people on the ground in Gaza who are able to bring you details?
Yeah, we do. And I talk to people in Gaza on a daily basis to try to understand what's happening. Some of these are contexts that I developed before October 7th, and others just using social media to be able to gather information.
You're literally getting in like people's messages on X or Instagram?
There's a doctor that I talk to in northern Gaza often, and we DM on Instagram, and sometimes he'll send images or videos. And it's important to have context there and in Israel, because my perspective as a journalist covering the Middle East for more than 7 years, and for the first time more than 10 years ago, is that this job can be done accurately and objectively if you truly talk to all parties involved. You don't have an agenda going into the coverage, and you just tell people what's happening on the ground. And in order to do that, especially in a place where you don't have full access, the centerpiece of that is talking to people. It's trying to gather information, and not just gather information, but confirm information. And that was part of the challenge during the war that lasted for 2 years, was not only gathering information, but confirming it.
Right. I mean, that's one of the challenges, and I think one of the frustrations that foreign correspondents have had with the Israeli government, because then the Israelis will push back on some reporting, right? But without freedom to move about, you can't confirm those details one way or another. When you are talking to folks who you've DM'd, how do you ensure what they're sending you or what they're telling you is accurate?
It's a great question, and it was very challenging as the war progressed, because some of the sources that we had were in Hamas, people that I had met inside Gaza before October 7th, and they would often try to spin the numbers or spin what was happening on the ground. And anyone who watches our coverage at Fox knows that we don't take a side in this. We are there to tell the truth about what's happening. We're not there to make anyone look good or bad. We're there to tell the truth and to report in an old school, objective fashion. And as it related to what was happening during the war, there were many times. There was one very famous example, the Al-Ahli hospital, where a number of Palestinian civilians were killed by a rocket that misfired from Islamic Jihad.
Right, and within a couple minutes, there was a headline that 500 people were dead.
There was a headline that nearly every media organization around the world ran, and Fox got it right. And it's not because we didn't have the information or the comments from officials inside Gaza at the time that were from Hamas. I did. I was texting with these people. I was sending voice notes, trying to get information on the ground. But we went above and beyond. I sent someone that I knew inside Gaza to go to the hospital and take raw video and then show me the geolocation on the video. And then I got other experts in the United States to look at this video and get their take on what happened here. Was this a rocket that misfired? Was it an airstrike? What is the
was
blast
it Israeli
radius
or was
look
it a
like?
Palestinian rocket?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And then I also had someone actually go to the hospital and count the number of people that they saw were killed. This type of journalism encourages patience because I would rather be right than first. And that's very important. I would rather be right than first. And that's not the case across the board. For us, we want to get it right. And we want to ensure that we're doing the legwork to do that. And that means not only talking to people inside Gaza, it means talking to our sources in the Israeli government, in the Israeli military, sometimes soldiers on the ground. During that same night, I received a video from a soldier who was along the Gaza border. And you could see in the video rockets that were misfiring. And I looked at the time.
These are Palestinian rockets that were misfiring and landing in Gaza.
Landing in Gaza.
Yeah.
The reality of this story is that you have to take each and every event and each and every day at face value. People love to make blanket statements about what's happening as it relates to the war inside Gaza. And the reality is you just can't. You have to report with nuance and accuracy. Because I can give you other examples of where the Israeli military came out and told us on the record, hey, these paramedics approached our position without any lights on. They were not in clearly identified ambulances. And we get that statement. And then 24 or 48 hours later, a video is released showing that wasn't true. We report that too, because my take from the beginning of this conflict is that we should be able to report on the story of Hind Rajab, of the Palestinian child who was killed just outside of Gaza City. We should also report on the Bibas children who were murdered after being kidnapped by Hamas on the morning of October 7th. And you just have to do this with clarity and accuracy.
You have probably, I can't imagine the messages, the emails, the DMs you get from people, because there's accusations, right? Like, ultimately, I think like a large part of the Jewish community in the U.S., pro-Israel community feels that the media, Western media in particular, has been biased against Israel during the war. At the same time, it's so interesting because like they'll protest outside the New York Times, and the next day you'll have the pro-Palestinian groups protesting outside the New York Times for being too pro-Israel. As you have covered this, as you have been taking in all the coverage by your colleagues, Western media outlets, etc., what is your assessment of the media coverage of this war, things that they've gotten, or the Western media has gotten significantly wrong here in terms of how they approach this war?
I would first start by saying I'm very proud of the coverage that we did at Fox throughout this war, because it takes a lot of resources and a lot of attention to compete at this level. And I truly believe, not just on the ground in Israel, but across the board, we are competing at the highest level at Fox when it comes to foreign coverage and specifically conflict zone reporting. I don't want to talk about other media outlets because I think my focus every day is how can we get this right and how can we be the best in the industry at what we do. You're right. A lot of people, especially online, want you to pick a side. They want you to only cover what happened on October 7th or only cover what happened during the war. My take is that we should be covering everything all the time to the best of our ability. And that doesn't mean that you're going to get every single story or you're going to talk to every single person. It's not possible. But from the beginning of this conflict, my take has always been the same, which is we should talk to as many civilians as possible to try and understand what the experience is like. But also, it's critical that our coverage on the morning of October 7th, when we risked our lives to get that story out to the world, and in the days after, is processed by our audience to understand just how horrific this terrorist attack was. And it's also critical that our audience understands that 2 years of war that led to the deaths of thousands of civilians and also thousands of terrorists is covered as well. And so my take is that, at least for us, and I can only be responsible for my reporting, is that it's fair and that it's objective. And so I shy away from ever criticizing my colleagues in the industry, even if I have thoughts on the coverage, because
I was curious if you think it's like agenda, it's bias, it's laziness, whether it's malicious or whether it's just like incompetence.
At the end of the day, I think you have to talk to everyone. You've got to be well read in also, and you have to have the context. And I think that's where our coverage stands out, because Yeah, people saw me on the morning of October 7th at 8:30 in the morning along the Gaza border with the gunfire by Hamas in the background as they were massacring civilians and the bodies and all these horrific things that we saw. And they saw our coverage throughout Gaza when we could get as close as we could to the story and report. That wasn't just an isolated piece of coverage. Even what I spoke about on the morning of October 7th was based on reporting in the Middle East for years. It was based on being inside Gaza during the 51-day war in 2014 and the context that I have been developing since 2014 in Gaza and in Israel. And so I think that set our coverage apart because it allowed us to talk about these topics not only with background knowledge and understanding of what's taking place, but also with empathy, because I don't approach this story from a one-sided lens. I approach the story from an understanding that I have gone to Shabbat dinners and to Iftar dinners with Jews and with Muslims, with Israelis and with Palestinians, and I've listened to them. Tried to not talk, but to listen, to understand why they believe what they believe, to understand the history that they choose to focus on, and also to understand that it's an incredibly complex region and conflict that if you are a reporter who makes blanket statements about the realities on the ground, my takeaway is maybe you haven't been following this story for so long because it's a long conflict.
And you hear that from activists all the time, right? Like, and I'll get pushback online as we cover it, and when I describe things as complicated, right? Because it is complicated. Like, no, it's actually very simple, Mosh. Like, it is very simple. They get upset by using the word complex to describe the conflict.
Yes, and also I think that I would say something in defense of the media industry and of defense of my colleagues, that I think people on the internet are very quick to judge and to call names of journalists who are doing their job as journalists. And often I come across these people and they'll say something about maybe one of my friends in the industry of, oh, they're very biased in their coverage of Israel and Palestine. And I'll say to myself and even to them, no, they're not actually. Just because they don't work at my outlet doesn't mean that I don't think they're doing solid reporting.
Yeah.
I have great respect for many of my colleagues in the industry. We hustle hard and we're number one for a reason, but we're very respectful and professional with our colleagues in the industry, and many of them do very great work.
What have you, I'm sure you learned a lot being on the ground there for a number of years, but like as an American, I should actually back up. Growing up in Pennsylvania, what was your experience learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Interestingly, one of the first memories that I have, I wanted to be a war correspondent from 19 years old, and everyone told me it's not possible. You're too young. They'll never hire you out of college. It's just not possible.
So you were in college and you decided this is for
I wanted to be a war correspondent in college, and everyone told me this isn't possible. I said, okay, watch me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And at the time, I built this company called News to Share, and we would sell raw video from war zones. And we started that out of our dorm room. But I remember one of the first memories that I have of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course, it was on the news a lot growing up. And I did watch the news. My father always loved the news and still does. He didn't work in the industry, but he's just a consumer of news. But I remember even in 2014, when I was 20 years old, when this war started and I was starting this business and I had this dream of being a war correspondent, I remember interestingly watching Fox and seeing a former Fox correspondent on the ground, either on the Gaza border or inside Gaza, and thinking, wow, that would be a cool job to have. He was there on the Gaza border, and I said, this looks like a really interesting job. And at that moment, I decided I'm going to go to the Middle East and I'm just going to cover this. And again, we had a media organization that we started out of our dorm room. We printed out press passes that we made on the school computers. And I had a camera that I bought off of Amazon, and I put it in a backpack, and I went to a local store and got this camo thing and used duct tape to write press on the front. I ended up actually buying a flak jacket once I got to Israel, but I had no idea what I was doing at the time, but I had a dream. And that was my first introduction. And I remember at the time, this is actually an interesting story, to get a press card from the Israeli government. And again, I was 20 years old, the youngest person to enter Gaza during the war then as a journalist. And you needed a letter from your editor supporting the press pass. You still do, actually. And I remember calling my college roommate, Ford Fisher, who started News to Share with me, and he still runs it today. And I said, I need a letter from my editor. Can you write up something?
Can you be my editor?
Send it over. Yeah, because it was just the two of us at the time. And he's really grown it since. It's very impressive. But he wrote it, and I gave it to the press office, and they gave me a press card. And then I linked up with some freelance journalists and entered Gaza. And it's funny because some of the journalists that were reporting there at the time are now, they're still in the industry, but they were all very nice and people that at the time I was asking, like, what advice do you have? And they gave me some advice.
It's very interesting, your story. I don't know if you followed the story of Richard Engel from NBC, but like not dissimilar, like shows up as we're invading Iraq in 2003. Yeah. Doesn't, is freelancing and like looking for work, but just literally lands himself in Iraq and is like, I'm here to cover because this is what I want to do.
Absolutely.
So that then takes us to the, you moving to the region, you joining, Fox News. What have you learned about the conflict, about the nature of Israelis, the nature of Palestinians, having been on the ground there that you think you try to share through your reporting or, via individual conversations you have with people?
That most people just want to live and just want to be regular people. And I remember in 2019, I was in Gaza doing a feature story, and the Israelis took out a rocket commander, Baha Abu Walata. And this set off a 3 or 4 day war, and I was trapped in Gaza City. And so there were airstrikes all around, rockets going out. It was intense coverage. And we were the only international team in Gaza because I just happened to be there when this happened. And I remember during that time, I interviewed this Palestinian man at a big square in Gaza City. And I asked him, what do you think about the rockets and the airstrikes? And he said, I'm just trying to sell paper. And I was like, okay, but what do you think about the war? He said, I own a paper store and nobody buys paper when they're shooting rockets. And I always remember this story because he didn't really care. Like, he was a businessman and he just wanted to run a small business. And the same in Israel. And this is the misinformation that people spread about this conflict, is that they just assume that everyone all the time, the millions of people that live in the region, are just constantly focused on war. And it's just not true. Certainly there are pockets of people who are, but you go to Tel Aviv, and you've been to Tel Aviv, you go on the Tayelet, and you could stop someone who's on their afternoon run or there to watch the sunset and say, what do you think about the situation in Gaza? And if they're not in the middle of the war or serving in the reserve duty, they'll be like, I don't know. What do you want to know? They're focused on having a cup of coffee, maybe going to their beach volleyball league. And I think that's the point that people miss about the region, is that they just assume everyone in the Middle East is consumed by war, and they're not. They're consumed by meeting with their family, having dinner. Everyone there laughs, loves, smiles, cries. They're just like us. But because it's the Middle East, people have their preconceived notions about what it's like.
Yeah, and it just gets so much coverage, right? I think this is a question we get all the time too, is that like for a country like Israel, the size of New Jersey, has about 10 million people in it, right? Then you had the Palestinian territories, you're about 15 million or so. And like in a world of 8 billion people, and countries like India that have 1.5 billion, and China, there's so much Western media coverage and US media coverage of sort of every nuance and everything that happens there. Having been in the region, like, do you have a better sense of why that is?
I have an answer for you. And I thought about this because people asked me this for years. Why do people care about this story in particular? My answer, and my thoughts on it, is that it's based on Jerusalem, the center of all religions. It's the intersection of so many religions. And you walk through the old city and you go to the Western Wall and you see Jews praying, and just above at what Muslims refer to as the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and Jews refer to as the Temple Mount, you see Muslims praying. And you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and you see Christians praying. And this intersection of religion, I think, makes the land so important. And long before we were ever here, people were fighting over Jerusalem. And I actually think long after we're gone, they'll still be fighting over Jerusalem. It has this historical and religious significance that people care about. And I think that's why.
Curious now that, we're a little bit into the ceasefire here, October 7th, obviously, and the war and the aftermath. What is the sense you get from Israelis and then Gazans who you're at least speaking to remotely or digitally about what a long-term solution looks like here?
My sense is that most of the people that I talk to don't claim to have a solution. And those that do often have an extreme solution.
Right. Like there's people advocating like, oh, they should all just live in one state, right?
Yeah, but there's also people, and you find this on, like I explain this to everyone, there's a spectrum in Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank of people. And it's a different spectrum, but it still exists. And you meet, when you're in Israel, you meet plenty of people who are peace activists, who protest against
Still today,
the war.
even after October 7th.
Yeah. And then you meet people who are on the far right of the political spectrum there and are calling for destroying all of Gaza and all of the Palestinian people.
Expelling all the Palestinians from Gaza.
Yeah. And then you see a different, but also a spectrum in Gaza. And you meet people in Gaza who just want to sell paper or run an ice cream shop. And then you meet Hamas terrorists who, if given the opportunity, would kill every Jew they could. There's a spectrum, but I would say most people don't offer a solution unless it's an extreme solution. My personal take is that it involves the humanization of all parties involved and the nuance of the realities on the ground.
Yeah. Do you think that's more difficult now, post-war?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's more difficult because when I talk to Israeli friends in Tel Aviv and I talk to Palestinian friends in East Jerusalem, the Israelis say, look what they did to us on October 7th. They slaughtered our people, 1,200 people. They murdered us. And they're right. It was horrific. I was there. This massive terrorist attack. And you talk to Palestinians and they say, look what they did to our people. They bombed women and children and they killed thousands of Palestinians. And you understand as an objective observer the pain of the people involved. And I think it makes it more difficult. And when I say this, right, like if someone were to look at what I just said, you will have people on both sides say, well, what about the nuance of this or
what
that?
About? It's a lot of what about. Yeah.
And you know what? I don't play that game. I believe in humans. I believe in the humanization of civilians and the accuracy of their human experience. And I don't think that as journalists, we should discredit the experience of Israelis or of Palestinians because they both have legitimate grievances and they're different. And when we report on these stories, we have to provide context. We have to let people know the day this war started and what that looks like. We also have to let people know about the realities of the situation on the ground in Gaza and who the world is dealing with. But that doesn't mean we have to dehumanize anyone.
You mentioned the day the war started, October 7th. You talked about being there that day. You've written a book about it, Black Saturday, New York Times bestseller. Congrats. Talk to me about what you saw unfold that day and what was unique about that day, given all, the conflicts that you've covered so far.
That day started with a call from my producer telling me that something was happening in the South. We just didn't have information on what was actually taking place. We thought it was a regular rocket attack, and these have happened before. Oftentimes, the Israelis will take out a rocket commander from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and it will lead to 3 or 4 days of conflict. That would happen sometimes multiple times a year since I lived in Israel. And we would go to the South, and we would report from Sderot, and
Sderot being a city down, Israeli city near the Gaza border.
An Israeli city along the Gaza border that has a population of about 30,000 people, and it has a lot of bomb shelters, so it's a good place to report from. So if you're taking rocket or mortar fire, you can get to cover. And you can look into Gaza from there. It's so close to the Gaza border. We were used to those stories, and until we really got to the South, that's what we thought we were getting into. I get this call from my producer. Within 6 minutes, I'm on the phone with the senior vice president of news at Fox, Greg Heaton, who's a brilliant journalist.
Greg was my boss for a few years.
Yeah, he's brilliant, and he is a man who understands news in a way that makes my job so much easier. Working under him has been a real privilege because he gets how hard our job is. And I had a conversation with him, and around that time, Tel Aviv starts to take heavy rocket fire. I get in my car, head to the South, meet the team. And there's a lot of details that you'll read about in Black Saturday, but ultimately, there's one decision that saves our life. We get to an intersection to film about 5 minutes away from Sderot, this town along the border. And when we get out of the car, there's gunfire all around us. And we have to make a call. Do we go?
At that moment, we should mention, Hamas fighters were still within Israel.
Hamas fighters were just starting to come into Israel. This was around
this is that early in the morning.
8:30 in the morning. We're along the Gaza border. I mean, we were the first international team to get down there because we didn't know what we were driving into. And ultimately, one decision saves our life because we stop at this intersection. We're going back and forth. Do we continue to Sderot? It's 5 minutes away. That's the place we report from. It's where we had planned to report from. And I made a decision. We're not going to move forward, and we're going to stay put. That decision saved our lives because 45 seconds down the road at the next intersection, Hamas had set up an ambush, and they were shooting everyone who drove past.
What was your gut telling you? Why? Why you said stop?
The gunfire. Because we were used to rocket fire, but the gunfire was different. And that was, to answer your question, that was what was different for our team. Everyone who did drive past us got shot. And people...
Even journalists.
Journalists were shot at. There's actually like a very famous moment. It's actually later in the afternoon, around 1 p.m., I think, where a lot of local photographers are pinned down right along the expressway. Some really great photojournalists. And ultimately on that day, 3 Israeli journalists are killed. Some of them who live in the border communities.
Because Hamas was basically invading and killing
everyone. Yeah, they weren't stopping to say, hey, are you a journalist? They were killing everyone. So I often think about what I would have done if we did drive to that next intersection. But the point is, we stayed at this intersection all day. We reported live on Fox, and people were dying right there. I mean, everyone who was getting shot just down the road or in the kibbutzim, the word for border communities in this area, they were turning the intersection that we were at into a triage point. And so I remember the first person that I saw die on that day. It was this soldier or officer. He had this long beard, and his friends laid him out on the ground, and paramedics tried to revive him once, twice. They were unsuccessful, and they covered his body up, went on to the next casualty. But I mean, that was horrific to see just unfold in real time, because these soldiers who were all shot up, there were bullet holes all through them, still alive. And it was intense. It was intense because also we didn't know where Hamas was. Then there was a time in the morning or early afternoon where the soldiers that are there sort of defending this intersection tell us, move to the other side of the road. Hamas is just there in the field across from us. And so they were close. I mean, in this area, you didn't know on that morning where Hamas was at. And also, while this is taking place and you hear the gun battles happening, and you see the wounded people being brought to this triage point, there are rockets coming in nonstop, one after another. And you're seeing some interceptions, some slamming into the side of the road. So it was very intense. And we stayed out as late as we could. The rocket fire got more intense at night. Eventually, we pulled back to a city called Ashdod in southern Israel. And then we spent the next few days with the army and the kibbutzim, going to Be'eri, to the Nova Music Festival site.
These were sites where massacres happened.
Yeah, sites where massacres happened. And, for days they were catching terrorists alive. We were with the army, actually, when they caught a terrorist at the Nova site alive. We were in Be'eri before it was cleared. There were bodies everywhere. It was horrific. And so many gunmen and militants had crossed in on that day that there were just bodies of Gazans all over the place. Like it was, you would drive down a road and on the side of the road, you would just see dead people. And sometimes you couldn't make out if they were Israeli or Palestinian because they were so.
I want to pause here on that, because one of the questions that I think, you probably get is, how do you as a journalist decide, where I think journalists, particularly the good journalists, are able to compartmentalize these things? How do you deal with what you saw as a human in the end? Do you have a good therapist, Trey?
I have a good company. Fox has gone above and beyond to take care of our crew. We just finished a 3-day retreat for my team that was there on the morning of October 7th, and it focused on post-traumatic stress. We did a follow-up session last week. From having free therapy sessions that Fox provides, to having the Calm app just for like meditation, to having executives at the very highest level of the company call and check in on the team, text. Like, this is a company that cares about its employees. And for us as war correspondents and as a team that not just covers the Middle East, but also the entire world, war not just there, but in Ukraine and Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and Pakistan. These are all places I've gone since I've been at Fox. They're really making sure that we're okay. And it's hard. It's really hard, actually, to cover this stuff and to see this stuff, because it's constant exposure to horrific realities. And it's not just there. We were in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, and there in the morgue, as these families identified the bodies of people who had been tortured under the regime at the Sednaya prison. It's going to Ukraine, to the front lines in the east, and seeing when the Ukrainians launched their counteroffensive, seeing dead soldiers and civilians all over the place. It takes a toll on the human psyche. And, my brand is to be this tough guy in a black t-shirt that goes to the front lines of any war zone around the world. And that is who I am. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me. And so, to answer your question, yeah, we actually have so many resources that, it's not like they advertise these resources because they're internal, like in the mechanism at Fox, but we have an executive team that cares about its employees. And I've seen that firsthand. They actually came to visit us. They went to the kibbutzim like while the war was still going on and southern Israel was taking rocket fire. Suzanne Scott, Jay Wallace, Lachlan Murdoch came and they saw firsthand what we're going through to make sure that we had everything that we needed and also to make sure that we had the resources that we needed after this war was over. And so it's been a process. It's difficult for the team, but I think we've become closer as a team because of this. And, my team deserves massive amounts of recognition. My producers, cameramen, editors, the team here in New York and in DC, like this is truly a team effort to cover these stories, not just in Israel and in Gaza, but also around the world. And it's just not something that I take lightly. It's something I really appreciate.
Having gone through those experiences, does it make you consider some days, or are you having serious talks about maybe I should come back to the U.S. and cover Capitol Hill? It's a different type of conflict.
No, I'm a war correspondent by craft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Being a war correspondent and witnessing what you witness, the worst of humanity, what has that taught you? Has that changed your impression of what humans are capable of, both good and bad? That experience, have you processed that in a way in terms of how your view of history, of humanity, of how we treat each other, how has all of that been affected by what you've witnessed?
I have this passion project called Experience Humans, and I try to highlight the people that I come across all over the world and to tell their stories in a digital media way on Instagram and just try to capture the experiences of humans in a way that makes people thousands of miles away care and empathize and connect. And I think our reporting at Fox, we do just that. We try to tell stories in a human's first way. You'll see when the packages that I do, I often open with the story of an individual, try to connect it to a broader current event. I think this job has taught me to be a better communicator. I think it's taught me to be a better listener. And I also think it's taught me to consider my life experience, right? We're so lucky to be sitting here in this studio in a warm building, outside it's raining and cold. We're sitting inside and, we can have food and water and anything that we want. I meet so many people around the world, whether it be in Afghanistan or in Syria or in Iraq or in Lebanon or in Israel, in Gaza, just all over. And so often we're there for the worst day of their lives. And so often we meet civilians, and I think of some of the civilians we met in rural Ukraine or especially in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, who had nothing. Really, they had nothing. They were living in a level of poverty that is hard to describe. It's hard to accept and even understand for many people here. And still, they'll give you their last cup of tea. I think about being in Morocco after the earthquake in 2023. In September of 2023, my team and I got to the High Atlas Mountains. And we hiked up to this village that hadn't been reached by first responders yet. No journalists, no aid workers, just a few hundred villagers. And we get to this village, and these guys are digging through the rubble of a house that collapsed. And they're looking for a little girl who was definitely dead. And there were so many people killed in this particular village. And they had already pulled out the body of someone else, and the family members were there just doing what they could. And they stopped and they took a break, and they had just a few pieces of bread and tea. And they insisted that we sit and eat with them. I haven't thought about that story in so long, but that to me is such a perfect example of the humans that we meet around the world. They're just like you and I.
And so it sounds like you're a consummate optimist, even, having seen what you've seen.
I try my best to find the good in the world, despite the harsh realities that we see, to find the light in the darkness. Because I also think those stories are stories that people can connect to. And I think that if I meet this father of a daughter in Morocco and he's digging through the rubble, and I try to treat him like I treat my friends, like a human, to humanize him, and when many others maybe wouldn't, because he is just a villager, as he would describe himself. I'm just a farmer. I'm just a villager. I hear that a lot from people. And I'm like, no, you're not just a farmer. You're not just a villager. You're a human. You have a family. You're a father. You're a brother. You're a son. You have hobbies. Maybe it's spending time outdoors or with your loved ones. But to humanize people, I think it allows people thousands of miles away to connect and to say, that's kind of like my brother. That's kind of like my father, or maybe my mom or my sister. And I think it allows our audience to sit in front of their TV. And there's this famous, not to go too into the weeds of my thought process on this, but there's this famous scene, and I'm going to paraphrase it in the movie Hotel Rwanda. It talks about the events of 1994. And one of the lead characters says something to the effect of, people are going to look up at their TVs and they're going to see this on TV and they're going to say, that's so horrible. I can't believe that, what's happening there. And then they're going to go back to eating dinner. And I think about that. My goal is to not make people get on a plane and fly halfway around the world to help or get involved, but it's to make them go back to eating dinner after watching one of our reports on Fox and have a conversation about what they saw.
You mentioned Kabul a few times. You were there for the withdrawal. There's been a lot of attention paid in recent days to the withdrawal, the Afghans who came into the U.S. As part of that withdrawal, given the National Guard shooting in D.C. Curious what you witnessed during Operation Allies Welcome, because a lot of people describe the chaos of that moment as people were boarding planes. Talk to us about what you witnessed there, especially in light of the fact that it's sort of being reviewed, reassessed right now.
So we first got in on a Qatari military embed to the airfield and reported live on Fox as people were evacuating on these planes. We later went back in and stayed for weeks amid Taliban rule.
This is after the Taliban took over.
After the
and
Taliban,
the US is
so
totally
the
out.
Taliban took over August 15th, and all those infamous images of the airfield at the airport in Kabul were like late August. The explosion that killed the U.S. service members was in late August. We were reporting from Doha at the time, and then ultimately went in late August just for that day, reporting from the airfield. And then early September, we got back in and reported for weeks. We actually had no way to get out for a long time. At the time, we interviewed some people who had worked with the Americans before, but it's a mixed bag of people. Everyone had different roles. Some people had already been coordinating visas with the United States to get out. Some had family members that had already gotten out. And so it was a mixture of people that we saw. And by the time we got to the airport, things were much more organized than the first day or two when you saw those images of people
running after the
clinging to
plane,
planes,
yeah.
dropping from the planes and stuff. We were there just after that.
Yeah. But in terms of the vetting that took place, ultimately, I think we're talking about upwards of about 100,000 people who were, brought into the country.
Yeah, none of the vetting took place in front of our eyes because that was all it was like paperwork behind the scenes. And so we met some people that had applied or that told us stories of working with the Americans, but I never really got a lot of information on the vetting process, only because none of that was really taking place on the ground. It's not like people were showing up to a hotel with their ID. It was a lot. There was some vetting that was taking place at the airfield in real time in those early days. You remember people like showing their IDs to see if they were on lists and stuff.
I was getting messages, and we had just started the Instagram page the year before, and a whole bunch of veterans started following us. And we were getting messages from people on the ground there. I was in some veterans WhatsApp groups because they were trying to get out, their translator and various folks who had helped them over the 20-year war in Afghanistan. And they're like, I think the North Gate is open. I think the South Gate is open. It was remarkable to see what was unfolding.
Absolutely.
There.
And I will say a lot of the veterans who were helping their former translators or people that worked, I have a lot of admiration for those U.S. service members because they were such loyal people. And I don't want to, just because I don't remember who was public and who wasn't about it, so I won't list their names, but a few names come to mind of people that served in the U.S. Army, veterans. They live in New York or D.C. now, and they were going out of their way to make sure that they could get the guys who were on their team out of harm's way. I thought that was admirable.
Curious, you mentioned your side projects and how you approach social media. You have nearly 1 million followers on TikTok. I don't know where you find the time between your Fox News hits, but also doing all the things you do on social media. But how do you approach your social media coverage versus what you do as a Fox News correspondent?
I think they complement each other. My number one priority has been and always will be my reports on Fox News. And I'm so thankful for that opportunity, to write a book about my experience covering the war for Fox News Books, or to be promoted to chief foreign correspondent and cover the entire globe. These are things I don't take lightly. I mean, this is a lot of trust that they've put in. I look at social media as a way to attract new viewers. The audience, as you see all the time, we engage with each other's content on Instagram. It's a younger audience. It's an audience that isn't always watching cable news. And so my take is, how can we get these people interested in the news? And I think the answer, simplified, is we have to meet them where they're at. And for many people, that's on TikTok. And so if we're doing a report in Afghanistan about the Taliban takeover, I'll take 15 seconds and do a selfie video talking about where we are or what we're doing. Instagram Reels has been big lately. I think one platform that's sort of slept on is Facebook. In the past year and a half, I've been doing a lot more to cross promote on Facebook. But the goal here is to get people to.
There's more overlap between the cable news audience and Facebook.
Yes, absolutely, and I've found that as well.
Yeah.
And so, look, I also post our reports on social media too. And it's to get people who are not in front of their TV, who maybe wouldn't know that we're on the ground reporting in a place like Ukraine or Afghanistan or Syria, to say, oh, wait, maybe I should tune in. And also it's about brand building. Like if you ask my friends, I talk about brand building all the time. I'm a huge believer in building media brands because I think your audience, wherever they're at, whether they're a cable news audience or a social media audience, A, they have to trust you, but B, they have to know who you are. And so you have to build a brand. Who are you? And I ask this. People come to me all the time. They ask for advice on social media. And not to be like Gary Vee, but he's like, how many times a week are you posting? And so often people who want to build these brands, they're not posting online. It's like, you have to get out of your comfort zone and do it.
You got to do it. And you also have to show a side of you that I think also having been in network news and cable news and now coming to this side, you got to show a vulnerability and got to bring down a transparency, I think, is super important. Is that something that, as you think about how you approach the same story for, the audience that's watching on Special Report at 6 p.m. Every night versus your social media feed, how are you approaching telling the same story differently?
I think what extra information that sort of is going to be on the chopping block, I try to use that in social media because, as a journalist, so often, we're getting so much information, especially from sources. And now I have sources in the Middle East, I have sources in Washington, all over the world that are constantly texting, calling. And so not only do I have a lot of information that I always first send to our internal listserv in case someone needs to use it for reporting.
Yeah.
But also I'll use some of it in my reports. Also video, or photos. I just have all this information and I would say the majority of it doesn't make it to air because when we have a 2 or 3 minute package and Special Report, and maybe if that's our only thing for the day, or we have a few live
By the way,
shots.
you're lucky you get 2 or 3 minutes. So when I was at Evening News, I had correspondents being like, you have 1 minute, 20 seconds to do the story from Gaza. Like, can I get a minute 30 tonight?
That's like an insider thing that people, if you're listening or watching, it's a constant battle for all journalists. You want to get as much airtime as you can, but the Special Report team is awesome, and Brett's really cool about making sure we can get our stories on from around the world. But whenever I have stuff that doesn't make it to air, I try to put it on social media or provide more context, or also just simplify what maybe is a 3-minute report. Can I simplify the main points in 60 seconds? And so that's what I try to do, is sort of condense the information too. Just
going around the world here, we're speaking just as Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are meeting with Vladimir Putin today in Moscow, or at least they're set to as we speak here. As you've been watching these peace talks unfold, I know you've spent some time there covering that conflict as well. What do you make of where things sit right now, and what leverage you think it might take in order to get Vladimir Putin to, agree to end the war? Because it's clearly here, he still appears to be in a much more powerful position than Zelensky and the Ukrainians.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time reporting in Ukraine. My guess would be somewhere between 200 and 300 days in and out, but a variety of trips. The Ukrainians are facing a very difficult situation. We were there in September, and within 24 hours of our arrival, the Russians launched 800 drones into Ukraine and 13 cruise missiles. And we woke up and there was black smoke rising from the horizon in Kyiv, massive explosions. And that's a very common occurrence for the Ukrainians. We've also seen the front lines. Last year, I went to the eastern front lines with President Zelensky, and it's an intense and very difficult battle. Right now, the Russians control.
It's like, what, a 600-700 mile front line there?
And it took hours to get there. It was an overnight train ride. It's hard to even describe to people how big Ukraine is when you're driving across it and when you just see where these soldiers are fighting. But the Russians right now control almost 20% of Ukraine. The deal on the table right now has been reduced from 28 points to 19 points. On Sunday, Witkoff and Kushner met with a Ukrainian delegation led by Rustem Umerov, who is the national security advisor to President Zelensky. They met in Florida, and they're trying to iron out the details of what this peace plan is going to look like. It's not a great plan for the Ukrainians because they have to give up basically most of the Donbass, if not all of it, to the Russians, what they've been fighting over. This is the eastern region of Ukraine.
The eastern region, even parts of it, well, they're at various points, they were set or being asked to give up parts of it that Russia doesn't even occupy yet.
Yeah, exactly. And then also they're going to have to cap their military probably at 800,000 soldiers, which is not a huge deal right now if they have security guarantees, but they have to give up something. And they will receive Article 5-like guarantees. And when I was in Ukraine...
By the way, just to translate that, Article 5-like is like not being part of NATO, but NATO-like guarantees, meaning if Russia is to invade them, they would get support from ostensibly the Europeans.
Exactly. And when I was in Ukraine, I hosted a few panels in sort of conjunction with our coverage there at the same time. And was talking with Keith Kellogg, President Trump's envoy, who's dealing with Ukraine. Also, Andrei Yermak was on one of my panels who just left the Ukrainian political sphere. After, we don't have time to get into the details.
Amid all the corruption within the Zelensky government.
That's a huge. We could talk 2 hours just on that story. But and a variety of other European partners who were there, the Estonians, the Italians, the French, who were on these panels, and we discussed, what does this mean? What does Ukraine need to win or at least be secure? And they, at the time, were speaking about what was actually initially an Italian idea for an Article 5-like guarantee that would give Ukraine the ability to rest assured that if Russia tried to relaunch an invasion in the future, that they would have the backing of the Europeans on the ground and the Americans from the skies. What ultimately will come out of this deal, we don't know.
Is this something you think Trump is willing to give them?
In part, yeah. Because it's very easy for the Americans to promise over the horizon capabilities and not boots on the ground, because there is this sort of cultural, and again, you and I, we live and breathe this stuff, so we could go into the rabbit holes of all this stuff, but I do think there's a cultural resistance in the United States to boots on the ground after Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Yeah. It's a harder sell to the American people.
It's so interesting because when you look at it historically too, and I know you're a student of history, we go through these phases, right? Like sort of out of Vietnam, we were very reluctant to get involved anywhere, and you actually probably saw it unfold in a certain way in Rwanda, right, with Bill Clinton, like still a lesson from Vietnam, like we're not going to get involved, and then obviously in the aftermath of that, 1 million people are murdered in 100 days, and then 9/11 changes things, and then we have Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years, and now we go through another phase here of like, well, that didn't work out for us, like no boots on the ground, but it's so interesting because this seems to be a conflict whereas, and I'm curious when you compare and contrast these two, your perspective, Israel-Gaza was a situation where at least the Arab nations, et cetera, could put pressure on Hamas. Trump, again, I'm oversimplifying this, could put pressure on Netanyahu and force them to the table. This is a situation where it feels like, well, a lot of people can put pressure or help out Zelensky, but Putin is like, what does it come down to in terms of getting Putin to agree to anything here? How much do potentially the Chinese play a role here? It seems like Trump has gone back and forth in terms of like carrot and stick to Putin. Like, I'll give you everything you want, but you still won't take it. Now I'm going to threaten you with missiles. That's not working. And it seems to kind of change by the day.
Yeah, it seems like right now they're in the carrot phase, talking about the possibility of economic
Right, that 28-point plan was very Putin friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the Chinese will play some role or involvement. There's been a lot of reporting around that. I also think that the reality for the Russians is that the war is no longer as bad for their society as it was in the early days. Putin is not taking frontline soldiers from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Those people broadly are not being touched. They don't feel.
Is it because he's curtailed his ambitions?
No, it's because he's recruiting from more rural areas of Russia where there's less ability to question his reasoning for launching the invasion.
Oh, so he's more strategically, he's being more strategic in where he's finding his troops.
He's isolating the money and power in Russia away from the war. And that's strategic on his part. But also you have to remember the military industrial complex in Russia has grown drastically since the war started. And in the early days, the Russians were having trouble keeping up. It's why they turned to the Iranians and others to get drone technology and things like this.
Right. It seemed like he was in desperate straits when he was calling Kim Jong-un for like 50-year-old bombs and the Iranians for drones.
Now we understand he's incentivized recruitment by increasing the amount of money that people can get paid from very poor parts of Russia. And also they've increased domestic production of weapons. And that's the concern of the Americans right now, is that the Russians are outpacing their own domestic production in terms of missile usage and what they're building. So they're making more missiles than they're using. And that's of concern to the Americans and the Europeans, because the question then is, okay, are they preparing for the possibility of direct confrontation with NATO in 2 or 3 years?
What is the sense then as to why Putin would actually end this war?
He may not. He may not. And that's the reality of the situation. Or, all of these players have long trajectories, right? And I think when you think of the Russians, not in the same way, but when you look at the Chinese, they have what analysts will call strategic patience. And the Russians also have some level of strategic patience.
They look at history in centuries and millennia, not necessarily months and years.
Exactly. So Putin could agree to a ceasefire and a peace plan for the next 5 years, 10 years, until he feels that there's maybe administrations around the world that aren't going to pressure Russia as much, and then launch a larger invasion. And he'll have that time to build up his military and prepare. That's
Zelensky's big fear.
Yeah. And the reality, it's the fear of the Europeans too. And it's why you've seen a lot of countries, including Poland and others, use this as an opportunity not only to train, but also to identify their own weaknesses. Because they talk a big talk, but when Russian drones are slipping past your air defense systems, it's a wake-up call. Like, this could be on your doorstep, and it already is on your doorstep, just one country away.
Yeah, we're seeing military buildup in Europe at a level we haven't seen since World War II, frankly.
Absolutely.
As you have covered the diplomatic initiatives here, curious to your perspective and your reporting on how the Trump administration has approached diplomacy in a very, we can say, non-traditional way, right? Son-in-law Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff's a real estate guy. In the last administration, it was Tony Blinken, it was the traditionalists, it was Bill Burns doing this sort of thing, the head of the CIA, Secretary of State. This time around, it's a very different approach, and it has, appears at least in the Middle East, in terms of phase one, paid some dividends. What do you make of the foreign policy and the approach Trump has taken in these parts of the world, and why, in some ways, it appears he's had more success?
I interviewed President Trump when he was in Israel after he addressed the Israeli Knesset, and something that stood out to me about the interview was how matter-of-fact he was as it related to the negotiations. I think this entire administration, they approach foreign policy negotiations in the way that they approach negotiations in New York City if they're doing a real estate deal, which is this idea of...
First, you could argue that the Middle East is one of the more complicated real estate deals in the world,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
But it's this idea of knowing what it's working backwards. Okay, what's the goal here? What do we want to get done? Okay, A, we want to end the war, and then B, we want to work out the details of what that looks like. It's almost a reversed approach to foreign policy, but in a way it ends up cutting through a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy that weighs down past negotiations that we've seen, even as it relates to Russia and Ukraine at a different level. But I mean, without going into the details of the Budapest Memorandum and how things unfolded in 2014 in the Donbass, and there was a lot of bureaucracy that got in the way of cleaning up a peace plan. As it relates to Israel-Gaza, even in the past, the Qataris and the Egyptians would try to get these deals together, and they played a critical role in getting this deal together, despite what you read on the internet. The reality is Qatar and Egypt are directly involved and remain directly involved in holding the peace plan together. And people can put their hands in the air and say, well, I don't like that, or that can't be true. There's a reason that the Americans go to these regional players to get things done, and why...
Things aren't clean in that part of the world, right? Like, you're not going to find pure players anywhere.
And the reality is someone's got to talk to Hamas. Someone has to talk to the other side. But so to answer your initial question, they approach these negotiations in an unconventional way, but also in a way that identifies what the end goal is, and then working backwards. Like, we'll figure out the details. Broadly, can we get two sides to agree on what they want to happen? And then we'll figure out the details of how we're going to make that happen. And I think that's interesting. It's, as an observer, as someone who covers this, we see the day to day, and you try not to get too bogged down in the details of these negotiations, because sometimes there's political intentions or sort of spins that sides have to make to get things over the finish line. But we try to confirm information. We try to talk to as many of the negotiators as we can, often off the record, more on background as officials from multiple different countries. And we try to get to an understanding of what's actually taking place so that we can better inform our audience of what's happening at the table.
One more thing I want to get to before we leave, as you've covered the conflict in particular, the Israel-Hamas war. I'm sure you've seen the, various protests in the U.S. and in Europe, the rise of not only anti-Semitism, but anti-Zionism. Like you start to see, and I haven't seen this as somebody who's cited this and reported on this, like a growing movement that like Israel doesn't have a right to exist, right? That, Zionism has become a bad word. How have you seen what's been going on around the world, the various protests, et cetera, impact what's happening in the region? Or are there two basically completely different storylines happening? What's actually happening on the ground, and then the protests and what's happening globally? How does what's happening around the world actually have an impact on the ground there?
It's a good question. And I'll give you a nuanced answer, which is...
I only expect nuance from you, Trey.
I really try my best.
Yeah.
Work hard at this. And the reality is it is a nuanced reality, because a lot of people like to make sweeping statements of this happened and it caused this, or this happened and it caused this. But there are facts that we have to cover. There's a massive amount of anti-Semitism in Europe and in the United States. We've got to cover that. I'm not someone who wants to draw direct conclusions of why things take place that have been historical problems, right? There's been a massive amount of anti-Semitism in America and in Europe for decades.
And I think we should remind folks that, like, no matter where you could go back to Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford, and you see it in, you could go back 100 years, 200 years, you've seen it.
And so I think it's silly sometimes when people want to make these like jump correlations of like, oh, this is happening, so this is why this is happening. No, it's just, there are timelines and things that unfold. What I see on the ground is that people are acutely aware of that. In Israel, people talk about the protests on college campuses. They talk about attacks that take place in a place like Colorado or some of the attacks that we've seen in Europe. It's on an individual basis, I would say, because sometimes you meet people who are really connected to what's happening and they draw correlations and they are watching the news and they understand what's taking place. And then sometimes you meet other people who say, I don't watch the news. I met someone recently that I went to university with who didn't know what happened on October 7th and just heard there was a war in the Middle East.
Those people exist, huh?
They exist.
Yeah.
And I was like, you're kidding, right? Like, she was like, no, I don't watch the news. My feed is fitness and food. I said, like,
I envy that person.
And she was very calm, but I just like, this girl that I went to college with, and she just didn't watch the news. And so the reality is, I think, depending on who you talk to, certain people will make correlations of why something's happening, why it's not. My take is we have to look at every single situation at face value. And you see it in the course of my reporting, you see it in the course of our conversation. I'm very hesitant to ever make sweeping statements because everyone wants to say good guy, bad guy, up, down, yes, no.
That's
black,
what people
white.
want,
And
man. They, people want to send me messages like, who am I rooting for here? Who am I rooting for here? Who's the bad guy? And I was like, it's complicated.
Yeah, and you could build a huge audience by picking a side, not in this conflict, but in any conflict.
I would have many more viewers and listeners if you pick a side, right?
Yeah, I'm not here to play that game. I'm here to do old school journalism. I'm here to tell the truth and to tell these stories in a fair, accurate, and objective way, to be the fourth estate, to hold militaries and governments accountable, and to be a fair, objective observer. And I'm lucky that I have the opportunity and have the backing of such an important and influential media company to give me the platform to tell these stories in a way that not only informs and educates, but makes people care.
Sure, we're going to leave it there.
Thanks,
man.
Thanks for having me.